So, Pat, I have a big question.
Hopefully I have a big answer.
Our last episode was a really great start, but do you think we could go even bigger for episode 2?
I'm not sure there's a bigger game than Super Mario Bros. But there is a bigger idea we could look at.
I'm listening.
We could look at the central theme of video game design history.
First, yes, I would like to do that. Second, if you're gonna say the central theme of video game design history, you gotta use an epic voice.
I think epic voice is your gig.
Okay, you talked me into it. Today on Big Ideas in Gaming, we're going to look at the central theme of video game design history. So, what is it?
The central theme is technical constraints create artistic styles.
We're probably gonna have to explain that a little bit, huh?
Oh, you bet we are. And that's good news, because it gives us a reason to talk about one of the best games of 2020, Hades.
For those of you who haven't played it, Hades is an action roguelite from Supergiant Games, the same people who made Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre. You play as Zagreus, the son of Hades, Greek god of the dead. Your job is to try and escape the underworld, fighting your way through 4 zones full of baddies, bosses, and traps. Along the way, you unlock a bunch of new weapons, and the gods up on Mount Olympus help you out by sending brightly colored boons to grant you amazing powers. No, Supergiant didn't pay me to say any of this. It's just a really great game.
It's also an amazing example of the central theme of video game design history. But in order to understand why, we're going to have to make one of our brief trips to the 1980s.
Way ahead of you. Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Specifically, we're going to the year 1980, which is one of the all-time great years in game innovation. But we're looking for a game that wasn't well known at the time. It was called Rogue.
This is the game that invented the roguelike genre, yeah?
Some people say it wasn't the first roguelike, but it is safe to say that Rogue was the game that inspired classics like Angband and NetHack, and then led to later games like Diablo and FTL. But we're interested in more than just Rogue. We're looking for the big idea that Rogue represents. Back in 1980, lots of computer game developers started trying to port the tabletop RPG to the PC and mainframe. Most of the time, they were trying to build something like Dungeons & Dragons.
Which seems like an incredibly daunting task, because D&D is so much more than just Dungeons or Dragons. All the imagination and creativity that goes into each campaign, not to mention rules and mechanics. There's just so much to tackle when actually thinking about D&D outside of just generic fantasy terms.
By 1980, D&D had done almost everything that an RPG can do. And no PC or mainframe back then could support a game that big. So, digital RPG designers had to make some big compromises. There were 3 strategies they used.
I know you love RPGs. I love RPGs. But we should probably just focus on Hades, right? I mean, maybe if our viewers want it, wink wink, they can request a video about the overall history of RPG design.
Good point. So, there was one strategy that Rogue was following. And that strategy is what I call specialization. Basically, the Rogue designers gave up on about 80% of the tabletop RPG.
Right, they left out plot, towns, NPCs, all that stuff. You're basically dropped into a dungeon right away, and you never leave that dungeon. Also, you die all the time. Or maybe I'm just bad at them.
No, I think that's a feature of the genre. Or maybe I'm also bad at them.
So if I understand this correctly, we've already arrived at our big idea, right? The creators of Rogue couldn't fit a full tabletop RPG in a 1980s computer, so they created a new style RPG that could fit on one. Technical constraint created the artistic style.
Pretty much.
Okay, great show. What's up for next month?
Wait, we haven't even gotten to Hades yet.
Maybe you haven't, but I've been playing the entire time we've been recording.
Yeah, me too, actually. Let me just finish up this chamber and quit. Okay. So, we're here to tell the story of a very big idea. And the way this story goes from Rogue to Hades tells us so much about the history of video game design.
Why don't we start with what roguelikes are? When I think of roguelikes, the big thing that comes to mind is procedural generation. Every time you start a roguelike, the maps are different, and you get random enemies, random loot, and even the stats on the loot can be random.
Yes, procedural generation is a big part of roguelikes.
The other thing about roguelikes is permadeath, right? Like, lots of hardcore roguelike fans say it's not a real roguelike unless you die forever and can't get any of your stuff back.
Absolutely. Permadeath is definitely part of the style that Rogue pioneered.
And then, you basically never leave the dungeon, right? You're always fighting monsters, disarming traps, and picking up loot. That's it. That's the game.
Yeah, that would be a good 3-point outline of roguelikes. There are also other smaller ideas that roguelike fans consider important. For example, roguelikes should be complex because there are lots of overlapping mechanics. Enemies should be able to do anything that the player can do. The player should be able to take any action at any time, regardless of context. But I would explain all those smaller ideas as being under a single, bigger idea.
We are here for big ideas.
The bigger idea is that roguelikes should always surprise the player. In a 2016 panel, the creators of Rogue explained that their original goal was to create a game that could surprise them every time they played. And that was why they started with procedural generation. Dungeons would be new and different and, hopefully, surprising every time.
But how does permadeath fit into that? I mean, it's fine if they wanted to make a game that's too hard for me, but there must be someone else they had in mind.
Right. The creators explained that permadeath is also there to make the game surprising. You have to remember that permadeath isn't just that your character dies forever. More importantly, permadeath means that your save slots are locked, and that you can only save when you quit. If you could just reload after equipping a cursed item or encountering a really dangerous enemy, then there's no such thing as surprise in the game. Players would just reload over and over again to get the results they wanted. Permadeath forces you to actually accept surprising results, even when they're bad.
Huh, I guess that kind of makes me hate permadeath a little bit less. But while you were explaining that, it also made me think about Hades. All those cool boons and their combinations, and you can't keep them when you die, and you can't reload your save to get the one you want.
Right. We're coming up on Hades here in a second. But the rest of the pillars of the roguelike are also about surprise. For example, the idea that enemies can use items just like the player can, that's also there to create crazy, unpredictable situations. The same is true for the ability to take any action at any time. In game design, we would say that these elements create high volatility.
Is volatility why some runs in a roguelike go really well, and then some runs hand me my ass on a platter in the first 5 minutes?
Yes, but it's important to remember that the creators of Rogue stumbled into a high volatility game in search of an experience that would be surprising every time. And not because they wanted the game to be incredibly hard. In fact, one of the developers of Rogue said that most roguelikes were too hard for him. But on that note, we should jump over to Hades, because it has a lot to teach us about the history of video game design.
For me, there are two things that really make Hades different and amazing. The first is that the combat is on point, and the interactions between the different boons make every run different. Like, one time I had this boon where my enemies got struck by lightning every time I knocked them into a wall, and everything I did knocked them into walls.
Yeah, one time I had this boon where I created this giant cloud that debuffed my enemies, and when I stood inside the cloud, I did extra damage. It was pretty great.
That's where the volatility is, right? The way that Hades surprises you by giving you lots of random boons that have lots of weird interactions.
Yeah, boons are the biggest source of surprise in the game, and I think the designers of Hades realize this. Because in addition to all the boons that happen to overlap, you also have explicit combos in the duo boons, which can really change the course of a run.
Maybe I've got the wrong idea about this, but that seems different from other roguelikes. Like, other roguelikes only seem to vary between hard and ultra hard. Sometimes they give you a piece of epic loot that lets you get through the dungeon, but most of the time they drop you in a room with a bunch of elite monsters who are immune to all your best attacks.
That's a pretty good picture of the roguelike genre. To explain the difference between those games and Hades, let's say we have a baseline level of difficulty. As you said, traditional roguelike volatility goes both above and below this level, pretty often. And a lot of the time, you get a big difficulty spike before you're ready, and then bam, your run is over. Hades mostly stays on the friendly side of that line. Depending on what boons you get, the game varies between I'm not sure I'm gonna make it and I'm an unstoppable killing machine.
Now that I'm thinking about it, that up and down change in difficulty reminds me of our conversation from last month. Roguelikes are kind of like arcade games. They get progressively harder and harder, mostly based on numerical things like enemy stats and starvation mechanics. But Hades isn't an arcade-style game. It's a composite game, isn't it? It's an action RPG.
It sure is. It's all connected.
Alright, so let me just hijack the graph here for a second. Old school roguelikes are really hard because the enemies are just a bunch of RPG stats, and those stats have nowhere to go but up. But Hades is also an action game. So sometimes Hades can do what Super Mario Bros. Did and give you new challenges that are different, but not necessarily harder. And that means the difficulty of Hades can ramp up more slowly than a typical roguelike, but it's still just as fun as any of the older games.
Right. The volatility in traditional roguelikes is all about forcing you to make tough decisions based on your character's stats. But in Hades, the difference between all those weapons and boons isn't just a bunch of math. Boons and weapons literally change the way that hitting, dodging, and blocking work, and players have to adapt their motor skills to those changes. So yeah, Hades is something that older roguelikes do not.
Alright, I guess that answers that question. Why don't we talk about the other unique thing in Hades, which is story. First of all, there is a real story here, with characters and relationships and everything. It's not just a premise.
The premise is really strong though.
Yeah, let me back it up and cover the premise of the game. In Hades, you are an immortal trying to break out of the underworld, and when you die, you get sent back to the House of Hades, and you have to do it all over again. So the whole core loop of fight, die, repeat is actually explained in the plot.
And in an amazing way too. Obviously there's the whole Greek mythology, which they use pretty accurately. But on top of all that, the quest to run away from home establishes the relationship between Zagreus and Hades really effectively. And then every time you die, there's a chance for that storyline to move forward a little bit.
The thing that really blew me away is how the story is told. There's a ton of non-linear dialogue from gods and other characters. As a voice actor, let me tell you that those short, non-linear dialogue segments can be some of the hardest things to pull off. And this game has hundreds, maybe even thousands of those.
Let me just say, as someone who writes for games, that stuff is also very hard to write. It's hard to tell a story when you don't know what order the script will be seen in. But the Hades team clearly had a plan for what they wanted to do with the story. By this point, you can probably guess what I'm gonna say.
They used it to create a sense of surprise?
Exactly. Now the main storyline can only play out by successfully escaping, but all the backstory plays out in little snippets that you can see in any order during dungeon runs.
So we're coming to the end of the video, and I want to play devil's advocate for a minute. I think that many people would argue that Hades is not really a roguelike. They'd call it a rogue-lite instead, because it has a plot and real-time action, and some parts of your character persist through death. Do you think that's fair to say? Do you think it negates the central theme that we've been talking about?
That's a good question. The easiest answer is that Hades is a roguelite, but roguelites only exist because roguelikes existed first. So Hades is still imitating the style created by Rogue. It just added some new elements to the formula.
So it's kind of like pizza. The pizza in Rome is different from the pizza in New York, which is different from the pizza in, say, Tokyo. You still look at it and go, oh, that's pizza, but each culture puts their own spin on it.
Hello.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. All styles evolve. Even in the early days of the roguelike, new ideas entered the genre all the time. But I think that we can also look at Hades another way. The creators of Rogue said two important things about their process. First, they said their real goal was to create a game that could surprise them. Second, they said they would have kept adding new RPG mechanics to Rogue, except that they ran out of memory space. Hades simply adds things to Rogue that its creators wanted to add, but couldn't. And it adds them in a way that's true to the surprising style of Rogue.
Okay, and that's a good segue into my second devilish argument. Hades was created for modern computers by dozens of skilled game devs with a huge budget and 2 years of beta testing. We don't have the same technical constraints we used to. So how can technical constraints create new kinds of games?
It is true that AAA game companies are only constrained by their budgets and how long a publisher will let them work on a game. But the central theme of video game design history continues because most of the really fresh design ideas are not coming from AAA games. They're coming from indie games. Indie game devs have new technical constraints. They can't afford the best technology. They don't have huge teams, and often they're just talented amateurs who have never made a game before. So they're forced to make artistic compromises the same way that the Rogue developers did. And those compromises lead to new styles.
This is kind of like an obvious alley-oop, but what's a good example of an indie game that shows the central theme of video game history?
Minecraft is the big one lately. The original developer of Minecraft had very little development experience and no budget to start. But he knew that if he made a game with lots of procedural generation and open-ended gameplay, that he could make most of the game by himself. And after he did it, the genre exploded.
Right, after Minecraft, you had games like Terraria, Starbound, Dragon Quest Builders, Trove, and Deep Rock Galactic. They're not the same game, but they all have some Minecraft in their DNA.
Exactly.
I think I've got an example too. I'm old enough to remember when the MOBA genre got started as a Warcraft 3 custom map.
Yeah. The original MOBA, Defense of the Ancients, was built by a few different amateur game developers using only the Warcraft 3 map editor. Their technical constraint was that they had to create a whole game out of things that already existed in Warcraft 3. Just like with Rogue, this forced them to be so creative that they came up with a whole new style of game.
Now we have all kinds of MOBAs like League of Legends, Heroes of the Storm, Dota 2, Smite, and Awesomenauts.
You got it.
Okay, I'm gonna try to sum this whole video up. Once upon a time, computers and consoles couldn't handle the games that developers wanted to make. So, the developers made some compromises in their designs to get around technical limits. But those compromises became styles, and then other games started imitating those styles. And now, games like Hades are pushing those styles further with modern technology while still staying true to the spirit of the originals.
Yeah, and I'd add that even though technology has advanced, technical constraints still lead to new video game styles. Indie game developers can't always afford the best technology. Many of them don't have much development experience when they start, so they have to design games around their own limitations. This also leads to new video game styles, and so the central theme of video game design history carries on.
Hopefully, just like this show, wink. That's where you come in. Thank you so much for watching. We'd love all the likes and comments and shares with friends and tweets and all that. If you have any ideas for upcoming shows, definitely hit us up down below. If you want to find out more about Pat and his work, in the description, it's there. We'll see you next time for another big idea in gaming.